to Inside the Recording Studio. And if you are familiar with that little intro, you'll know what we're about to speak of next. I'm Jody Whitesides. With me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Jody.
How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Good.
How about yourself?
I'm doing all right too. Had a relaxing weekend, and I've got another relaxing weekend coming up, so good stuff is aboard.
Good for you. That's awesome. It's good to take a break. I think that's one of the hard things to do, actually. I think to allow yourself to take a day or so off.
Yeah.
Do you agree that it tends to be like and I don't encourage this at all, but it tends to be like a 7-day
grind
week, yeah. So it's not good. But to hint at your intro there.
Yes, that was part of the reason for taking the weekend off previous weekend and the upcoming weekend.
We'd be remiss if we didn't mention the passing of Eddie Van Halen.
That is correct.
And that was, of course, your intro of Sammy Hagar onto the 5150 album, was
that
it?
Is correct.
Yeah.
That was a Sammy Hagar intro for Van Halen.
Yeah. So
good enough.
Right. There you go. Good enough. Good enough to do something. Yeah.
Exactly.
This is gonna probably sound wacky, probably off the top of the head, but me being a guitar player, Eddie was never a huge playing influence on me, as much as he was for others. But it's hard to get past the influence that he had on just guitar tones and playability and all this kind of stuff that just permeates beyond his type of a thing, right? But I know you were much more of a Van Halen fan than I am. So I know this was something that you kind of struggled with a little bit when you kind of learned about his passing here. So maybe you can share your thoughts on what Eddie meant to you.
Well, I don't know if it was so much that he meant a lot to me. It was certainly one of those elements, if I look back on things in my career, where some of my early beginnings parallel his. I still have a guitar that...
Really?
Oh yeah, I got a lot of them, but here I'm turning away from the mic like an asshole. And if you're watching the YouTube video, you can see that I'm holding up a custom painted guitar that has been heavily modified. It was my first original guitar, and I'm not going to hang it back up because it's a pain in the ass. It was a Fender Squier, and originally, while attending a music school with a buddy of mine, he wanted a single coil pickup. And he came to me and said, "Hey, will you give me one of your single coils if I give you a humbucker?" And
Deal.
I'm kind of like, sure. So he comes over to my little flat that I had in Hollywood at the time, and we proceed to Frankenstein the shit out of my guitar, much like Eddie trying to buy parts to create a guitar that plays well for him. My first guitar became that for me.
Cool.
And he brought a drill and a drill bit, and instead of routing, we routed with a drill bit by hand.
Oh, Jesus.
So when you pull the guitar apart and you take the pick, where the pickup is now, it was originally, we routed it out with a drill to get the wood out to put the humbucker in where the single coil was. And then we took a soldering iron and melted the pick guard to melt the hole. To make it big enough for a humbucker, just to get that thing in there. As you do. Yeah, because you're young and you're stupid and you do whatever you can to make an instrument the way you want it. So he got the single coil that he wanted. I got the humbucker that he gave me. And I really don't know. And I asked him what it was, and he didn't know. Recently.
What the pickup was?
Yeah, which pickup, what kind of humbucker it was. I'm going to assume that it was a DiMarzio, but I do not know. And I may or may not still have it sitting somewhere in storage. The current version that's in there now is a Seymour Duncan custom that was actually custom wound just for me. So it's been replaced as of since. Eventually, what I ended up doing was filling in the other two holes of the neck and the middle and neck pickups and creating a custom paint job on it. Not so much like Eddie's, where he kind of threw tape all over it and painted it until he kind of like, oh, that looks cool. I had a very distinct image in mind, and my dad being a graphic illustrator made that very easy. Getting the paint off the guitar was not so easy.
Yeah.
The original paint job that came from Fender, man, those things were painted like fucking tanks.
Yeah.
I mean, it took me days to get the paint off of that and get it down to the wood and then fill in with wood filler to fill in the rest and create the paint job. So in that regard, my early days of early guitars and wanting guitars to be to a very unique specification, because this is not the original neck. The only thing technically really original is the body and the tailpiece.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the only original things left on this guitar. But the interesting thing about that is the guitar plays really well. I think you've played it. I know a bunch of other guitar players have played it. It's been used on more records than I have been on, because people borrow it and they're like, oh, dude, it looks, originally when it didn't have, it had this weird, wacky thing to it before it was done up with the paint job. It played great. It sounded great. Didn't look great. So now it looks, even the headstock is kind of funky, because it was a very metal headstock when it was originally put.
It was the hockey stick?
It was the hockey stick. And
Nice.
I sent it to Justin, who does all my custom electric guitars now, and said, do something about the headstock, because somebody actually meant, dude, it looks metal. And it's like, yeah, but I don't want it to look metal. So he lopped it off and gouged it out and made it look even weirder. So it's either the ugliest looking thing, or it's like, wow, that's so unique, it's cool. So
yeah. So you're saying, like, so the spirit there of messing around with your gear to make it work for you, that was a big thing that you kind of tip your hat to Eddie. Yeah,
well, of course, because he did all kinds of things to, whether he figured out how to power soak an amp by using a variac to get the gain that he wanted without the volume to, tearing heads off in smaller venues when they were playing their earlier gigs. Interestingly enough, I did buy a couple of Marshall cabinets around that same time. And while I did not have a certificate of authenticity, I was told that Van Halen had owned them and they were his.
Yeah.
So
I have a feeling that there was probably 85,000 of those cabinets.
There probably were.
That belonged
I have
to
no
Eddie
idea,
at one point.
Being that they were, sold apparently to, I don't know how the Guitar Center people got them. I don't know, but they were used and they were claimed to be Eddie's, and I don't know. I don't have them anymore in my possession. I believe I got rid of them. If I still have them, they are sitting in storage somewhere.
Don't say where that storage is.
No, I won't. But
here's the address, and it's open between these hours.
It's quite possible that I do still have those two cabinets, and they were with original Celestion speakers and such as well. Yeah. So who knows? They may or may not have been his. I was told that they were his.
Right.
But in terms of that, and then in terms of being an inventor, I have invented a foot pedal for more modern uses of playing guitar.
That's probably another episode in itself. But that might be a cool thing for you to do on like a Tuesday tip or something. Actually show that thing.
To show the pedal.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So it becomes, I feel in that regard, I've been a little bit of a parallel, and there's several guitar players that are very famous that I feel like I'm in parallel to in that regard for various things that they've done in their careers that I've done in mine. And it wasn't because I loved them or emulated them in that, it was just that driving need to satisfy my own whim to go, oh, I need to be able to do this. Nobody makes that yet. Or nobody's done this yet, or that kind of thing. So it's that. And at some point, who knows, maybe I get to be big enough on a guitar playing scale that somebody would want to laser my original guitar that I have for the feel of it. Because it plays extremely well and it's very comfortable. Yeah. So, and that's kind of the whole point of having a nice playable guitar like Van Halen Ernie Ball, because I think they did that. They lasered his to get all the little nooks and crannies of all the parts of his guitars to be like his very well-worn original thing.
Very possible. I know they did that same thing with Steve Lukather's Valley Arts that he had.
Mhm.
the robot.
Well, he probably still has it.
Yeah, he still has it, but I don't think he really plays it anymore, at least not in official capacity. But they lasered the neck, and that's the same as on the at least the first generation of the
Ernie
Luke
Ball, yeah.
Ernie Ball Luke, yeah, which I'm a proud owner of. And I love that because I have
Yes.
small hands, unlike my co-host here.
I was just talking about my hands with somebody last night. They are enormous.
Yeah. You should
somebody
be a
mentioned
basketball
that
player.
my fingers are not like normal fingers. And and then I mentioned Paul Gilbert, and I'm like, Paul and I have the same size hands, except for one feature. It's the pinky. His fucking pinky comes like almost to the very tail end of his ring finger. Mine is more normal, but aside from that, we have the same size hands. He just has a slightly longer pinky than I do. So.
Yeah. All right. So
enough of that.
Yeah.
Van Halen.
But yeah, so
moment of
very
silence,
sad,
maybe.
obviously. But we have the legacy of the music and all this kind of stuff, and we will be happy with that. But today's topic, we're going in. Well, speaking of sound, as we tend to do here.
Yes.
Right? We're talking EQs today.
EQ. Yes.
And I think just getting into that, I think it warranted an episode because I remember when I started out, I think there's a lot of sort of like mystery around EQing and what it actually is and what it is. And people tend to just go in there and start turning knobs or whatever happens to be. So
did they come on stone tablets back then? Is that what you're trying to say?
This is before stone was invented.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So this goes back into the early, I don't know, insert joke here, but so we're going to talk EQ today. So
that's the idea anyway.
That's the idea. So that was another smooth transition, wasn't it? It's like,
smoother than last week's.
That's true. Yeah. Last week was just a gear
abrupt
shift.
Right turn.
Right. Yeah. But on a broad scale,
yes.
With EQ, there seems to be two schools of thought. I don't adhere to either one of them, and we'll explain why in a little bit. But some people say...
So you're saying there's a third school? The Chris school.
Yeah, that's right. It's like Yngwie, right? It's your way, my way, or the Yngwie, right? The right way or the wrong way, or the Yngwie, right? No, but some people are huge proponents of only cutting, and some people seem to be in the other side of the fence where it's like, no, only boosting.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? And then I'll tell you mine.
I can see the benefits of both schools of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I do know people that fall in one camp or the other. In other words, the camp of, I only use cutting techniques in my EQ, and another, other people that I only use boosting techniques. For me,
mm-hmm.
I'm in that third camp like you. I boost when needed and I cut when needed.
Ding, 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 ding. That is the correct answer. Yeah.
Well, that's your answer. It's not necessarily the correct answer.
No, well,
it's our answer.
It's our answer, but I do feel strongly about it. Somebody I mention a lot on this podcast because I'm a fan of the product. But Stephen Slate said one time he was doing it as sort of like a tutorial on EQ.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to set it straight right now. So credit to Stephen Slate for this, but this is how I think as well. He says, if the audio you're listening to has too much of whatever frequency, then you cut that.
Yes.
If it doesn't have enough of this frequency, you boost. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
It doesn't. Right? That is correct.
Right. Yeah.
I would agree with that statement. I wouldn't say it's correct, but I agree with that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think also from like a cutting or boosting sort of mindset, either or, I used to be almost like afraid of EQ. Right? Oh no! I read.
It's like Halloween. Jason's
but,
coming after you with an EQ knife.
Yeah. Oh no! What if I cut too much? But seemed to be like, when I was reading about this and scouring internet forums and all this kind of stuff, it was like, no, you should never boost or cut more than a couple of dB. And then you try to adhere to that and stuff doesn't sound good.
Maybe you got it wrong on the way in, just saying.
Well, it could have been that too, right? And that's very, very possible. So that again is assuming that everything is sounding as good as possible on the way in, but that we all know that that's not always the case.
No,
right? Sometimes you have to do drastic boosts or cut, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and there's also, I should throw in a little disclaimer here, because there are some formats that lead you to thinking you need to do something when there is actually nothing there to be done. And I will just say right now, I am remixing a project that was originally recorded many years ago on an ADAT setup.
Yay!
And the ADATs had a very interesting problem in that nothing above either 15 or 16K existed, period. Done.
Yeah.
End of story. It was not laid down to that format's tape at all, which means that if you want air above 16K, you're not getting it from the tracks you actually tracked with. So you're adding it by some other means, by either using a reverb or something. But even if you start trying to do some kind of crazy ass, like 20 dB boost of 18 or 20K EQ, you're getting nothing. You're just going to get the noise from the actual EQ unit, because there isn't anything from the actual recording you're getting. So it goes to a certain extent. It depends on the format. If you're dealing with modern recording and DAWs today, you generally don't have that problem. But if you're being brought an old project from some other format, you may have a problem where it doesn't matter what you do to boost it, it ain't there to boost.
Yeah, and full disclaimer, I think that was how the first generation of the ADATs had that limitation. I think on the second one they actually had it higher. But you're absolutely right that there was, like, I think a 16K just cut off. It's like
gone.
Nope,
Nothing above 16K. It's not there.
Right. Yeah, it was just the
It was their filters to hide. My understanding is it was filters to hide digital artifacts that it could not properly encode for recording.
Right.
And it was their way of being cheap enough that people could afford them, because there were probably filters that could do it. They just were ridiculously expensive, and it would be unaffordable at the time.
Right. Yeah. So, so I think one thing to keep in mind is if you're starting with this kind of thing and you're kind of new to mixing or recording.
Yes. Let's get back.
First thing, just don't be afraid of boosting or cutting if it needs it, right? There is no rule. And I know that when people say that, it's almost like when you're starting out, don't tell me that everything is wide open, because that's too large of a parameter to work with. But what we like to say here, it's all content dependent.
Yeah,
right. So different things. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah. You don't have to be afraid of things if it actually needs it, but know why you're boosting or cutting something by 10 dB.
Oh, come on. I like doing it willy-nilly. What are you talking about?
That's one way of doing it. But it might get unwarranted results or interesting results.
It's quite possible, yes.
Right. And also other things that I think we've all found ourselves doing initially in our as we start out here and we think of EQ. Okay, I don't hear the bass. I got to boost the low end of the EQ. So yeah, you can do that, or you can just push up the bass fader a little bit.
Yes. Although same project that I'm remixing right now.
Yeah.
I went back and listened again to a mix after taking a couple of days off it and going, oh, that's just, even though I'm doing an attenuation at 100, it should be like reducing it so that it's not hitting the sub so hard. However, there was apparently an insane amount of sub in this particular bass. So it was like, you know what? I got to go back in and add an actual lop off a high pass filter.
Yeah.
On it. So, but I'm getting a little bit of ahead of where we're going in this episode, because we're still kind of touching on whether you're going to be using corrective type of EQ or sweetening types of EQ with your boosting or cutting.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good thing to bring up. It's like knowing what it is that you're attempting to do with the EQ, right? So it could be, for example, let's say that there is a certain ring in a snare that is unpleasant. You might find that, frequency and kind of tuck that back a little bit, or as much as you have.
That would be kind of a combination of correction and sweetening now, wouldn't it?
Well, that's usually the end of how it ends up, right? Because if you're correcting something, or like you said, if you have too much low end in there, you're rolling something off to correct something that will ultimately make it sound better, right? But it could also be that on a guitar tone that is not cutting enough in the mix, maybe you need to poke it a little bit in somewhere in the mids, like 1.5 or 2K or something like that, where you might have to just add a little bit of a bump there to make it cut through the wall of everything that it's competing with, or vocals, whatever that it happens to be.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of gets in a little bit of the correction and sweetening areas, because I would, people say sweetening. To me, I think of sweetening as give each instrument its little home of where it's kind of supposed to reside in the frequency spectrum. So if you have guitars that have got too much low end, well, now they're going to be competing with the bass, which actually normally takes up the low end. So if you don't lop off the bottom of the guitars using a high pass filter, they're now competing with the bass. And it's the same thing with bass. Unless you really need the pick attack, you really don't need those to be super sharp in the high end, where the guitar is generally needed for a bit more of the clarity there. So you can roll that off on a bass using either a low pass filter or something else. So why don't we make that jump into the different types of ways that we can actually do EQ at this point?
Sure. Let's do that. So if we start on both ends of the frequency spectrum, we have something that we call either a low cut or a high pass. It's just a different word for the same thing.
Low pass or high pass, or low cut or high cut, yes.
Yeah. And now you just mentioned the other end of the spectrum, right? So we got like a high cut or a low pass, where we have a certain slope that sometimes we can adjust and sometimes we can't, meaning how aggressive that cut is, where you're either rolling off the low end or rolling off the high end.
Okay. And you know what? Thinking about this right now, people are probably going, what the hell does he mean by that when he's saying how aggressive this slope is? Well, let's define that real quick, because the slope of a filter, when you're doing a high pass or low pass filter, is usually denoted in matters of octaves.
Yes.
Sometimes it's not quite octaves, but 12 dB per octave, 24 dB, 36, 48. They usually go in increments of 12. Sometimes they do something slightly different. We have a
6 as well. Yeah. So like a little bit more of a gentle slope.
Yeah. Or 6 or an 8 or something. And what that means is how fast that's going to slope the amount of audio coming through before the next octave hits. So of a frequency. I feel like that still isn't like a good explanation, but that's exactly what it is.
Well, you can think of it like this: like the higher that number is,
the steeper the slope.
The steeper the slope is, and the more aggressive the cut is.
The volume difference between where you're at and the next octave down on it is going to be that amount of dB in difference.
Right. So in other words, if you have, let's say that you have an instrument, let's say that it's a vocalist, chances are you're not going to have a lot of information, possibly even like below 100, right? So you set a let's say a low cut filter. Yeah, I want to make sure I stay on
high pass,
the same words here. Yeah, let's say high pass. That makes more sense. So we're lopping off the low frequencies here. If you set that to 100, now depending on the steepness of the slope that you were mentioning there, Jody, it's going to include frequencies that are lower than 100.
Yes.
So the higher the cutoff, the more aggressive that is. So that means that you could potentially set the, what did I use? I said low cut, or
Yeah.
I said high pass.
High cut, high
See,
pass,
I'm
low
confusing myself here. So how is anybody going to keep up with this?
Right, and just so people know, a high pass and a low cut filter are the same thing.
It's the same thing. Why it means that I'm tripping over my words here,
Right.
and I will probably continue to do throughout the whole podcast here. But that means, so if you have that set at a certain frequency, you are actually getting lower frequencies. It's not like everything is like 100 and it's just lopped off.
Right, it's not a brick wall.
Right, it's not a brick wall.
To say the octave, let's actually really quickly define that as you're going, because the octave from 100 going down would be 50. It's half the value. And as you're going up, it's double the value. So it goes to 200. But if you're at 100 and you're taking 12 dB slope at 100 as your high pass, low cut filter, by the time it hits 50 dB, you're down 12 dB in volume if you're using a 12 dB slope. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, but
good.
Hopefully it makes sense to everybody else. Yeah. A great thing to actually learn about these things as well is, I don't like to propose like listening with your eyes, but if you have some sort of like visualizer, analyzer, you can, like Logic has a great one actually built into its EQ that you can just activate that gives you visual representations of the frequencies.
Waves makes a good one too. The PAS, I think it's called the PAS.
Yeah. There's a lot of them, I'm sure. And there's probably not a whole lot of them out today.
Fab Filter, I think, makes one too.
Fab Filter, yeah. All of these. So you can actually see what you're actually doing to the audio, and that can help in understanding of the process with what's there. So or what you're actually doing to the audio. But use your ear, obviously. Don't let it say, because we're not mixing with our eyes. It's like, it says this value right here. But it doesn't
you.
Says me. Yeah. But that's the high cut and the low cut, or
yes. So that we kind of took a real long turn on that first type of EQ type. And before we jump into our second type that we're going to talk about, let's take a quick break for our sponsor.
Let's do that.
And we're back. And right now we're going to we're going to talk shelving types of EQ.
You tend to stock your shelves?
I do. I stock them with all kinds of things.
Right. So how's a shelf different than a low pass or high pass?
High pass filter. It's similar-esque to the high pass and the low pass filter. The difference is that it does not keep going down the slope.
Right.
The slope is how quick it goes from one end to another in the EQ curve, which is known as a Q. We didn't really mention that in the filters.
We'll get into that a little bit later.
But we will get into that. The shelving then, instead of dropping things down off to infinity, it actually brings it down to the frequency that you're getting into from the previous frequency based on this setting of Q. And then it's level all the way out from there. So that's the main difference between a high pass and low pass filter and a high filter or a high shelving EQ and a low shelving EQ.
Right. Yeah. So it's also, it's sort of governed by a dB value rather like but the difference here as well is that you can boost these also. It doesn't have to be cut as it is in a filter. You're not
the
just
filters are a cut.
Up.
The shelves are either a boost or a cut.
Or a cut, right. Yeah.
But then they stay even across the rest of the length of the frequency spectrum instead of going off into infinity of nothing.
Correct. Yes. And you can use these in conjunction as well with the filters also. So that say if you want to boost the low end a little bit, you can do that with a shelf, but maybe now you get too much subs. You can have, a low cut on that as well, and it would just continue. That boost will go up until it hits the filter, essentially.
Right.
So creative tools. So that's the extreme ends of the audio spectrum. So
for
then
EQs,
we get in for EQ, right? Mm-hmm. So now we get into, what about that big thing in the middle there?
There's nothing in the middle. What are you talking about?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's where a lot of the stuff lives, right? It's big body of sounds. So then we have right? So then we get something we call like bell curves, where you can also boost and cut a certain range. And just like you said, how quickly or slowly, as it were, on the filters, how it drops off. With a bell, we can adjust that as well with that Q value that you were.
Yes, and we're not talking about grades in school, although they kind of have a similar concept.
And it's also, we can have
curve.
different shapes of the curves and all this kind of thing. But we are now cutting or boosting a particular center frequency that will, affect a little bit of the frequencies right next to it. It's not like, oh, I'm boosting 1K, it's only 1K. It would affect, the frequencies to both sides of it.
And how much it affects on the boost or the cut is based on a terminology known as Q.
Right.
The higher the Q, the sharper the curve.
Mm-hmm.
The lower the Q, the wider the curve.
Right.
So a lower Q value means you're going to affect more of the frequencies around the frequency you're centering on. A higher Q means you're going to be affecting less of the frequencies around your desired frequency that you're using for your bell curve, or otherwise known as a band pass.
So that begs the question then, well, why would you want to change that?
The Q?
Well, yeah.
Because you can. No, I'm just kidding.
No, No, what I'm trying to get at here is it depends a little bit on what you're trying to do with the boost or the cut.
Yes.
If you have if you're correcting an issue, you might want to have, not all the time, but you might have a more narrow of a cut, or in this case, it would be a cut, right? To bringing something out. You might affect too much of the actual signal if you have too broad of a cut. If you're boosting and doing things, I would say, as a rule of thumb, you can kind of think like, if you're correcting something, try to have it a little bit more of a narrow band, and you might get a more of a musical result. The same thing, if you're boosting something, you might want a wider curve so that you it just sounds more pleasing. It can start sounding very unnatural if you have a really, really narrow boost around a certain frequency. This is, of course, as we like to say, content dependent.
Yes.
So cheers. But
these are also very generalities, is a good way of saying it. If you are doing corrective EQ, chances are you're generally pulling something out to correct something. You're not really boosting to correct. And for sweetening, generally you are doing a gentle, a wider, gentle boost. That's a general thing.
There are no necessarily hard and fast rules, but that's about as close to as you can get, I think. It's, of course, it depends on what you have to do. If you're cutting something and you have a wider annoying frequency, then you need to have a wider band that you're cutting, but
to make it less annoying.
Exactly. So,
all right.
Generalities, but that's the functionality of them, and they do have a big impact on what you do. And
of course,
if you spend a little time, just kind of getting comfortable with what all of these parameters do, I think you start getting more and more comfortable actually using your EQ, and you know what to listen for and what to look for, and how to, just like compression or any other tool, you get comfortable using that tool that's in your tool chest.
Yes. And it's a good idea to understand various reasons of why you'd use different types of EQs. And speaking of that, let's move on to yet another type, which is known as a parametric EQ.
Right. So tell us a little bit about that.
The parametric EQ is more like a, it's, man, how do you describe the parametric EQ? It is specific bands, generally speaking, that you can set to do wide ranging. It's generally more of a broader spectrum type of EQ, the parametric EQ.
Yeah, kind of in my head when we're talking about EQ, that's the type of EQ that I tend to have in mind, right? When we can set the frequency of whatever we're working on.
Yes, and then it kind of gives a broad brushstroke to the whole thing rather than a very precise brushstroke, like a fine pencil line compared to a big paint stroke. I guess parametric is more of like, as I would envision it, a big paint stroke. And other types can be more narrow. The other type being, going down the list, would be graphic EQs. Graphic EQs are very fine-tuned, like pencil line type EQs.
They can be, yes. Yeah.
Right. So the parametric is more like your high and low pass filters and your shelvings. Not so much. I mean, they also include the possibilities of doing bells, but they're very general in the sense of where they tend to be set. The most famous, I would think, of parametric EQs would be the Pultec.
Sure. Yeah.
That would be my guess. I mean, there are others, but that seems to me like the most famous of all parametric EQs.
Well, see, for me, I think of just about any EQ, and I could be wrong about this, but this is just how I think. Anything that has where I can adjust the actual center frequency of what I'm using, I'm thinking of that as a parametric EQ. So even if that's your sort of stock SSL or whatever EQ it is, when I have a sweepable frequency that I can adjust, I think of that as a parametric EQ. The difference would be the graphic then, right, where you have a set frequency that you basically, with a fader, you boost or cut.
Yes.
Right? So
And that's the distinction between a parametric and a graphic EQ, is that a graphic EQ has a very set Q and it has a certain number of bands and they're defined. So if you're using a graphic EQ and it's got that narrow band, and graphic EQs are like your scalpels.
It could be
a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
Graphic EQ is more of a scalpel where you can cut things very, very precisely if that graphic EQ has that frequency band that you need.
Yeah. You can almost envision, if you're old enough like I am, you can look at like old stereo systems. We used to talk about the EQ curves being like the smiley face.
Yes.
You know, where we boost the low end and the high end and we cut everything in the middle to give it kind of a visual representation of a smiley face. So that's the graphic EQ. And I work less with them, but sometimes you see them. You know, you can see them in people's racks and things, but it can also be like if you're looking at, let's say, an old boogie guitar amp, that kind of thing. They actually had like a graphic EQ on them when they had like, I think it was like 5 bands that you could adjust, that kind of thing. So that's the difference between those. And I think that can be also a decent way to kind of learn about EQ, because you're looking at, you kind of get used to, I think, a
very specific frequency and smooth.
Yeah, well, and what that sounds like and what it does, you know. But personally, I don't use them most, but it's the I don't use them as much, I meant to say, but there's the old there's certain of the APIs that are like that, right?
Yes.
Or don't you use a couple of like the old APIs where there's not, it's just, it has essentially the graphic EQ. You can
it's a graphic EQ.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you can treat certain DAW EQs that come in your DAW or as third-party plugins that are kind of like, you can make certain ones that are parametric like and make them graphic in a sense. Like you could do that with the iZotope EQ plugin that you can get. And in that you can make the Q so narrow that it essentially becomes a graphic EQ.
Yeah. Yeah. just what you're looking at is different essentially,
Yeah,
but
you're
you
not looking
ultimately
at a
end up
very
having
specific
a
band.
very similar effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that pretty much covers our different types of EQs in terms of like curves and balances and the way you name things when you're using them EQ wise.
Yeah. So the last question that and you kind of touched on this a little bit before here, but why would you use one over the other? Or why would you use like one type of a filter or a typical band over the other?
Well, we've both touched on it in a sense. Whether you want a precision edit or a broad smooth curve is the two main reasons of whether you're choosing one type of EQ type or curve or filter over another.
Right.
And in saying for correction, most often when you're correcting something, you are doing very narrow cues of cuts so that you can get rid of certain things. And to that end, if you look at something like, let's go back to iZotope, where they make those RX noise filters and they will pull out certain things. You see that when you do it and it analyzes your sound and then it creates this specific EQ cut just for you, it's probably got 5 or 6 or 7 different little, very narrow, look like fingers, pulling a lot of like stuff out without doing too much damage to the rest of the sound around it, but pulling out the noise or the resonance of something that you don't want.
Right. And it can be in different harmonics as well, right? So you might need to have
Right.
like multiple of these little dips throughout the audio signal. Yeah.
Yes. And then in terms of broad smooth curves, generally you're thinking of those either in, well, there's too much low end down here, so let's pull a shelf. And then after that, let's pull a, high pass filter. So you might have so much low end that you need to bring it down in a shelf, and then you realize that it's still kicking too much into the sub, and you put a high pass filter on that as well. Or you do one of the, or maybe you just use the high pass filter and set it for a gentle slope at a higher frequency, and then it rolls everything off nicely. It just depends on where you want things to punch you when you're making your sound edits for EQ.
Right. Yeah, and then obviously same thing for the high end there. If you got like a nice breathy vocal as the intention, but it's just not there. Well, maybe a little bit of a high shelf would be in the order there. Boost something around 5K or something like that to just kind of bring out that breathiness.
Well, it also depends on who you're using too. I mean, if you go with like the Maag EQ, where they have a very specific air band, and you can make that selectable up to 40K. Not that you're really hearing that, but based on the shelf that it creates, and you boost way up into the 40K range, you can get some really nice spatial quality out of that EQ. And that's why so many people tend to use it.
Yeah, it's that voodoo that they do.
And they do it so well.
Indeed. So that's a little bit of EQ. There.
Yes, and we do have different EQ concepts that we will be talking about in the future as well. So
but I say that the first, what I would recommend to anybody that's listening and you're not comfortable with using your EQ is just don't be afraid first. Just bring one up and kind of mess around and see what it does to the sound. But if you're familiar with some of these concepts, at least you have a starting point of what it is that you're trying to do. So there are certain things that, well, we'll go into that later, but there are certain techniques that maybe we should do. Maybe actually be a good Tuesday tip to do how you can use a very narrow band EQ to spot problems in a mix, and how you can kind of do that. So maybe that's something that we'll think about doing.
On this this coming up Tuesday, should we do it then?
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah,
Let's do it then. I think will be a good tip. I think that's pretty much what I would like to say about the EQ here as a little bit of an introductory kind of overview of the tools that we're working with. Anything that you would like to add to that?
Not at the moment, but you know what I'm feeling?
I think I do.
Friday! Friday Finds.
Yay!
Yes, and as usual with Friday Finds, we kick it off with Chris. So, Chris, what have you found this week that people ought to know about?
I have been digging into my plugin folder, and this is a plugin that
How deep
don't
is it?
think. It's deeper than it should be, and not as deep as I want it to be.
There you go. All right.
Yeah, more plugins than I need, and not as many as I want. But this is I mentioned a plugin from the same company in the past. I think TSE Audio, but this week, I was working on a mix for somebody where I felt that the bass needed a little bit of help.
You don't say.
I do say. So this plugin to the rescue, it's called Bass Overdrive.
Bass Overdrive, that sounds like a pedal.
It is kind of built around the idea of a sound amp. And it does, well, I think it's awesome for bass tracks. You can use it, or I frequently use it in line as well, just on the whole signal, or sometimes, like I did in this case, as a parallel thing we just send to it. But it essentially a bass pedal, an overdrive pedal. I do believe this is a freebie as well. So
how can you pass that up? Come on.
For that price, you can afford not to like it, right?
Yeah.
But no, but it is a really, really good thing. And for me this week, that was exactly what I needed for this track. I just slapped a little bit of this on to kind of give some girth to the bass. And it's one of my favorite things to do. Throw a little bit of bass or distortion or overdrive on your bass track can help them just sit and get a little bit meatier in the mix.
You know who loved doing that? Marcel Jacob loved doing that.
I'm sure he did. Yeah.
That was like his thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you listen to those, certainly like the Talisman records, like it's got, pretty meaty tone there, I think. So, what have you got for us this week, Jody?
This week I have not put my hands on it just yet, but just the concept around it actually looks really awesome.
What's that?
The Boss GT 1000 core. That almost sounds like a gigantic supercomputer. And in a way, it kind of is. Although I don't know if it actually has 1,000 cores. It is a guitar effects processor. It is a hardware box. So it is not a plugin. It is a hardware box. It is a stomp box type thing that does tons of processing. Amp sounds and all kinds of effects, and allows you 24 simultaneous effects blocks.
That's it?
Yeah, just if you don't 24? Need any more. Just 24. It does the processing of all audio at 9632. 96K 32-bit. With 32-bit floating floating point processing.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah, so that's quite the unit right there. It includes classic Boss effects, their vintage stomp boxes. So they've gone and modeled all their own old stomp boxes and put them in here.
Yeah,
and they've created new multi effects to go in this as well. So they've apparently imported patches directly from the DD500, the MD500, and the RV500 series pedals. It apparently has ultra fast patch switching and delay carryover, which is
neat.
Yes. Yeah. And that's always a nice thing, because many years ago, before all of this stuff became what it is now in these tiny little boxes, you had to go to somebody like Bob Bradshaw to create you a custom rig to do stuff like this that cost tens of thousands of dollars. Now you can get them in little boxes that do it all in one. Or of course, you could use MainStage, and you can do the same thing there. It does effects carryovers as well. Or not. You can turn it on and off as needed per patch switching. So it also has looping functionality inside it. Of course, what pedal would not have that now? And a high resolution tuner that can do both single notes and polyphonic notes, which means it can
like
do
the TC
singles.
stuff.
Like the TC polytune, yes.
Polytune, yeah.
So it also has send and return loops, so you could add even more effects if you 24 simultaneous effects channels is not enough. You can have even more using send and return effects loops. Crazy enough. Yeah. I don't even understand how that, like, why you'd have to go that far.
Well, I'm just left with like one question regarding this. Well, does it make coffee as well?
It might. It very well might. In
maybe
addition
that has
to
to go on the loop. Yeah.
Another crazy thing that it can do is you can load IRs into it. It has 16 slots for using IRs at the same time. So you could have 24 effects channels and 16 cabinets that mic'd in various ways inside this thing.
Jesus.
Yeah, it's pretty nutty. It also supports a whole lot of Boss's expression pedals and other MIDI functionalities. So,
wow.
In addition to this, I mean, the list just keeps kind of going.
You sound like a commercial here, Jody.
I almost do, and it's terrible. I should not be sounding like a commercial. But in addition to that, when you do patch switching, it can also, if you're using hardware amps outside of this little unit, it can switch your amp channels for you. So it's that one button switching thing that can change a whole lot of stuff all at once.
Right.
And it's also
sounds like a pretty cool little unit.
It sounds like a pretty cool little unit. They do also allow for recording and editing through this little thing. It's like it's almost like a portable little DAW in a little unit.
Right.
And then it has a dedicated mode for all you bass players out there as well. So it's not just for guitars.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll have to take a little look at that. I'm unfamiliar with it.
So Boss, I think we all like coming out trying to be Boss again.
Yeah. I think we all started out with like Boss pedals, right?
I did.
Isn't it?
I know I did.
Yeah.
I had
me
quite
too.
a few different of their distortions. I had the DD5 delay and the DD3 delay and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's when you realized you needed to have a power adapter for your delay, or you started going through batteries every half hour.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So that's my Friday find for this week.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Jody. Yeah. And I think on that note, we'll say good afternoon, shall we?
Good afternoon to everyone out there. Or if you're listening in the middle of the night, good night to you as well. Or whatever you're doing. By the way, before I sign this completely off, if you have made it to this point, you should go smash the buttons on our website to follow us socially, jump on our email list as well. And if you're really digging it, throw a donation. We won't ignore it. We won't, I swear. So
thank you for that, Jody.
Yep.
All right. Everybody out there, have fun.
See you later.